the most important thing for me is that we as a team are able to score every single game, except for the Tottenham one. I'm not sure, maybe that was the only game we've played this season that we didn't score. Is that true, what I'm saying? Tottenham was only, because you are from Stats. So.
As it turns out, Forest at home, seeing at the time, didn't score, just in case you were wondering. Another interesting morning here at the AXA. Before the press conference began, all the talk was of that Haaland contract, but then as soon as Arne Slot got started, suddenly the news was about a Liverpool striker rather than a Manchester City one, as the bombshell dropped that Diogo Jota may have suffered another injury setback and may not make the game against Brentford. We spoke about him and what this means for Liverpool's transfer plans, both ins and outs, what it could mean for the rest of the forward line, and we spoke also about the threats of Brentford and why they're one of the hardest teams to prepare for. I obviously asked Arne a question as well. Mine was about depth and about goals from the bench, and he had some interesting things to say about that, as he always did. And we'll discuss them soon, back in the lab. Hello again, happy Friday everyone. We are back in the sanctity of the lab, ready to go over everything Arne had to say in his pre-match press conference ahead of Brentford. Now, you can tell that the manager's been working hard because he didn't have time to shave, although I've heard it on good authority that stubble Arne is actually quite a good one, so maybe he should continue with that. He had some pretty tough questions to answer as well, particularly after the early bombshell that he dropped regarding Diogo Jota, so let's get into that before we go any further. There was no movements and no questions once again about contracts, but when it comes to injuries and team news, obviously there was some people who noticed in the last training video that both Diogo Jota and Diaz weren't involved in training. Now, with Diaz, it was just a sore throat, so the expectation is he'll be fit and available for Brentford on Saturday. However, with Jota, it was slightly different news. The word is that he felt a niggle during the game against Forest. He was able to continue and finish the match, but it meant that he hasn't trained in the interim. So, reading between the lines, you didn't come out and rule him out completely, but considering some of what he said, it would be a surprise if Diogo Jota was involved against Brentford, which is a massive blow considering how much of an impact he's had in recent games. Liverpool just looked a lot more likely to score when he's been on the pitch, and obviously some people have been frustrated with the fact that he hasn't been starting games since he's come back. He's had 6 substitute appearances in the league and just had 1 start in the League Cup. But this is why Liverpool have been trying to be very, very careful with him to make sure that he doesn't re-injure himself, and yet here we are again. It's such a frustrating thing for everyone involved, and we have to remember this is frustrating for the player. No player wants to be continuously injured, but it does start to come into really grander focus at a point when kind of faith is being dropped a little bit in some of the other striking options. Diaz as a number 9 clearly didn't work against Forest. There's been lots of talk about whether that experiment should be shelved, including on my Substack. Go and read it. Also, Darwin Nunez, faith is kind of waned in him considerably in terms of his ability to be an effective striking option. But that does lead me to my top takeaway number 1. Diogo opens the door for Danns. Now, David Lynch asked a very good question about whether or not Diogo Jota's injury would actually mean that Jayden Danns doesn't go out on loan as expected and is able to stay within the building. Now, Slot did mention the fact that he has 3 other striking options, including Nunez and Diaz, but he did include Danns as an option. So clearly, it's in his mind that that might be worthwhile to keep hold of him, particularly over the course of this time while Diogo Jota is injured. Now, again, reading between the lines, it didn't appear as though Slot expected Jota to be out for a considerable amount of time, although we've heard that before. But the fact that he is considering not taking Danns or not leaving Danns out on loan is a significant update. I think what Slot mentioned was the difference between the short-term goals of the team and the long-term goals of the player. And sometimes you find this when you're talking about younger players. The idea that, yes, they would be more beneficial to them to go out on loan and play regular football week in, week out at a senior level. But then even if there's only 1, 2, maybe 3 times over the course of the next 6 months where you'd rather have him available to bring off the bench and where he can create a spark, is that enough? Do you want to be able to keep him in the building? I think for most of us, this is actually a quite difficult conundrum. I'm kind of glad I'm not the manager and having to make these decisions. But my gut feeling is that he still will end up going out on loan. But I think there's lots of Liverpool fans who would quite like the idea of having him there just as a fail-safe, just as an emergency, particularly as it looks like we're not going to be signing any new strikers in January. Top takeaway number 2, tiredness doesn't tally with the stats. Now, Slot was asked about whether or not the intense schedule that they have coming up has meant that he's had to do anything differently in terms of training and preparation, and Slot refuted that idea. He basically said that we've been doing this weekend since the first Brentford game all the way back in August, which kind of goes to show that Liverpool have probably had to deal with that more than most other teams. And again, like I mentioned in the last show, Liverpool are actually used to the rhythms of this a lot more than other teams. But what it also means is that the preparations for this kind of play began way back in pre-season. Slot mentioned the fact that pre-season was where they began to prepare the players for this, and we've seen a lot of elements around it since. Now, it's clear that they are paying very keen and detailed attention to each individual player's workload. You can tell by the fact Slot referenced the fact that the Dutch players are going to be playing against Spain in March, so he expects Virgil, Cody and Ryan to have 2 very tough games at a point when everyone thinks they're having a rest. So he's clear that he's on top of all of these things, but as I said, back in the pre-season was when a lot of these plans began. We've seen as well, he referenced the idea of players getting a week break in the middle of the season. So you think about Virgil, McAllister, Gravenberg, who've all missed times, whether it be through League Cup games or suspension in Macca's case, where they've been able to give them a little bit more rest than they would have had otherwise. And obviously, from Liverpool's perspective and from a lot of the fan base's perspective, you look at the recent performances and particularly maybe some of the slow starts and you think, well, maybe they are getting a bit leggy. Maybe it's catching up with them in a similar way to the way it did towards the end of last season when fighting on all fronts appeared to kind of wear Liverpool's tyres down a little bit. One thing I would say about that is just because it happened last year doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen this year. This is a new manager, a new regime, a new way of playing, and all of those things can make a difference in how Liverpool deal with these kind of things. And most importantly, the stats don't bear out the fact that Liverpool are tired right now. For the second press conference in a row, Slot referenced the fact that Liverpool's physical stats, now those normally be the distance covered, the sprints, intensive sprints, pressures, are all up after the winter break, as he called it, or the second half of the season compared to what they were previously. So as of right now, the numbers say that Liverpool aren't tired. Now, whether we want to believe that or not is another thing, but I think this is another key message of Slot's in terms of there are no excuses for how we are or aren't playing. He looks at performances over the course of results. So even though results are bad and the normal way of doing things is to think, oh, well, something's changed, so that's why the results are different. Slot, once again, as he said last week, said that's mainly down to the opponents and the strength of the opponents. He said that playing games in the second half of the season is just tougher for a multitude of reasons. And I guess we're just going to have to see how it goes and hope that he is right and hope that his plans and his preparations for this intense period of the season come to fruition. Otherwise, we may well be in exactly the same position we were in 12 months ago. Top takeaway number 3, Slot knows what he's up against and he knows what he's working with as well. Now, he was asked about the big news that dropped earlier this morning about Erling Haaland's 9.5-year contract and the spending of other teams in general and what that meant about the strength of the Premier League and the toughness of his job to try and win it. And Slot, it was kind of a window into how he views spending in general. And I think it's interesting for me and for most of others to be able to see what this is, because a lot of the time when it comes to these kind of transfer questions, money questions, he just gives the hard part straight back. He doesn't really go into details, but there are little clues you can pick up, like the fact that he mentioned spending when talking about Nottingham Forest last week, which again is not something that most people always reference, but clearly within football and within his mind is something that makes a difference. And Slot's kind of given the impression that he doesn't really care about those kind of things, but he did know exactly how much Chelsea has spent, down to the 0.2 billion. He also referenced Manchester United as well as Manchester City. So he knows that there are other clubs who are going to be there. But what he said was that I still like the squad that we've got, and we are still able to compete with all of those teams who spend incredible amounts of money. Now, this was the big takeaway for me. He was saying, we are able to compete with teams who spend incredible amounts of money, which suggests that he knows that his team isn't going to be one of them. Now, we've been around here before. We all know that there are lots of people who are unhappy with the way FSG run the football club in terms of how much they're willing to spend, when they're willing to spend, and on whom they're willing to spend it. But the reality is that Arne Slot knew all of that when he arrived at the club. He knew exactly about why and how they go about their business in terms of transfer funds. And yet he was still happy to come here. He said, this is the reason why people come to the Premier League, because you want to compete against the best. You want to be able to beat the best. And as of right now, that's exactly what Liverpool are doing, sitting at the top of the Premier League. So it's hard to know exactly what he really thinks about the idea of Liverpool not being one of those teams who spend incredible amounts of money. But one thing you can say for sure is it's certainly not a surprise to him. Now, it's time for me and my question to enter the fray. I asked Slot about goals from the bench and about how a surprising stat about Liverpool aren't being actually that good at it.
Attacking depth is such a massive commodity for all teams at the moment this season, and Liverpool's have been much celebrated this season, but we actually only ranked 12th for goals from the bench. Jota's was only the third time this season Liverpool scored a goal from the bench in the Premier League this season. And you've spoken so often about how games are tight, and going up against a team like Brentford, who are very good at scoring late on. Is this something you'd like to see improving on? And do you think there's something your attacking subs need to do more to kind of affect the game?
No, because there was not many times a reason for them to affect the game with a goal. Of course, every play we want to score goals, let that be clear. But one of the things I would like us to do better in the second half of the season, the first half of the season, although it wasn't many times necessary to make a late goal winner, or is that the way to say it? So there were a few games, United, Fulham, this one, where we created chance after chance, because everybody only reminds the Maguire chance, but in the 7 minutes before we created 3 big chances. So we had a lot of chances in these 3 games to score the winner in the last phase of the game, but for almost all the other games after 75 minutes we were already leading. So there was not a real necessity then to score in the end, but in the 3, 4 or 5 games where we weren't winning yet, we did create a lot of chances, but were not able to score. Like I said, it's such a small sample size. If there's only 3 or 4 games where we needed a goal, it's a bit simple to make the conclusion that we don't score it then. So then hopefully we don't come in these situations a lot. But we definitely, if we are coming in those situations, have 1 or 2 or 3 times a moment where we do score in the last minute of the game when we deserve it.
Now, what we got here is what I can already call classic Arne Slot, in as much as that he turned an apparent weakness into a strength. Now, obviously I said that it was a surprise that Liverpool are low down on the goals from the bench chart. Only 3 goals, and all of them come from Diogo Jota. But Arne Slot turned that into a strength to say that there hasn't been that many times when we've needed a goal late on. So because we're always in the lead, it means the necessity for scoring goals late has been lessened. So perhaps that is the reason behind why we haven't scored as many goals from the bench, which is an interesting way of looking at it. Although, what I would say in counter to that is the fact that Slot has mentioned as well that how many games have been close for Liverpool and how many times there's been one mistake or one good goalkeeper save away from dropping points. He referenced that in terms of why the results don't seem to be the same as they were. It said performances are level, but just those one or two things different make the difference. He also said last week that he'd actually quite like us to have bigger leads so we can rest players and so we can be a little bit more calm towards the end of the game. So when you've got players coming off the bench, if they can score the clinching goal, a goal that takes it from 2-1 to 3-1, from 1-0 to 2-0, and makes everyone a little bit calmer, then yes, that does make a difference. I wonder whether or not it's just something that he is internally talking about, the ability of players off the bench to affect the game. Because if you look at last season, it was something Liverpool were really good at. With this exact same squad, 12 goals they scored off the bench in the Premier League from 7 different scorers. And as I mentioned, so far this season, it's only been Jota who's been able to do it. So this is something that you'd like to think Liverpool can improve upon. And when you think about Arsenal, their current attacking depth or lack thereof, the fact that everybody seems to be trying to buy a forward in the Premier League in this January transfer window, the fact that Liverpool have got 6 frontline forwards really should be an advantage that can help them over the line in terms of the Premier League. But we need to start making it an advantage. We need to get other players who are coming on late in games to be able to score. Now, Liverpool still score more goals than anyone else. It's important to mention that. But we'd also quite like to see some late winners. I mean, just from the fact that it's a great thing to experience when you're watching a game. You see your team win a game late on. Like we thought we were getting that at Newcastle. Unfortunately, Kelleher's late mistake robbed us of that particular joy. But there's nothing better than winning the game late on. And when it gets tight, you really do want to be able to say that we've got the depth, we've got the power to be able to go further and later than anyone else and win those games. And we saw against Fulham, we saw against Manchester United, we saw against Nottingham Forest. We're still creating those chances. It's just that we aren't putting them away. And as far as Slot's concerned, creating the chances is the most important thing. So here's hoping that that tide will turn in the near future. But there we have it, another press conference review in the can. I want to say, first of all, big thank you to everybody who has donated to the Mo Needs Some New Equipment Fund. I should probably be more open about all of this stuff. Essentially, I am doing this as an independent. The company that allows me access to the press conferences aren't actually paying me any money for the privilege, so I'm having to do this all off my own back and use the equipment I've got. I've tried to make a few changes this week to try to improve vision, to try and improve sound, so hopefully that has done the trick, but if it hasn't, then all I can suggest is please be patient with me. I am aware of these things. I am trying to make it better for all of you out there. If you do want to contribute to that fund, there's a link in my description to find my Buy Me a Coffee link, so you can. All of those donations do absolutely help, and I do thank you for all of those who decide to choose to do it. If you can't do it, then all I ask for you to do is to just keep watching these videos, and that will hopefully give me some benefits as well. There's plenty of other places you can catch me. I mentioned Substack earlier. I have my column on This Is Anfield. This month there's going to be some about transfers. Obviously, I'm still on the Anfield Wrap. I'm still going to be doing the Late Challenge. And there's a few other places out and about that you may be able to see me. I was on LSE TV this week doing the press box after the Forest game. So, plenty of chances to get your Mo on. I'll see you all next week.